Welcome back, friends. If you're new here, pull up a chair, get comfortable, maybe pour yourself something warm, because tonight's story is not the kind you'll forget easily. My name is William, and I've been telling stories on YouTube for a few years now. In that time, you've trusted me with your evenings, your Sunday mornings, your quiet drives, and I don't take that lightly. Most of the stories I tell you come from strangers, people who wrote to me, people who needed someone to finally say it out loud for them. But every once in a while, a story lands in my inbox that stops me cold. Not because it's shocking, not because it's violent or strange, but because it's so ordinary, right up until the moment it isn't. This is one of those stories. It came to me from a woman named Kate. She asked me not to use her real last name, and I'll respect that. Kate is in her early 60s. She lives in a quiet town in the English countryside. She was married for 22 years to a man named Thomas. A good man, by all appearances. A quiet man. Steady, reliable. The kind of husband who remembered anniversaries and always filled the car with petrol before he handed her the keys. 22 years. And then one night, a completely ordinary Tuesday night in November, Kate heard something through a baby monitor. Something that didn't make sense, something that couldn't be explained away. And from that moment, nothing about her life, not one single thing, was ever the same again. I want you to understand something before we begin. This is not a ghost story. There are no monsters here. What Kate discovered is far more unsettling than any ghost could ever be. Because ghosts aren't real, but lies told across 22 years of marriage, those are very, very real. So, let's go back. Let's go all the way back to that Tuesday evening. The wind was picking up outside. The radiator in the hallway was making that low metallic knocking sound it always made in November. And Kate was sitting in the dark, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold, listening. This is her story. Kate had lived in that house for 18 years. She knew every sound it made. She knew which floorboard creaked near the top of the stairs. The third one from the landing, always the third. She knew the way the front door needed a firm pull, not a gentle one, or it wouldn't latch properly in the cold. She knew the particular groan the kitchen pipes made around 10:30 when the boiler cycled off for the night. She knew this house the way you know your own breathing, without thinking about it, without needing to. So when something sounded wrong that Tuesday evening, she noticed it immediately. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning of that night. Because what made that evening strange wasn't one big moment. It was a dozen small things lined up one after another, like dominoes that hadn't fallen yet. Thomas had come home from work at his usual time, 6:45, give or take 5 minutes. Kate heard his car in the gravel drive, that familiar crunch, and then the front door. She was in the kitchen, a pan of soup on the hob, the radio on low in the corner. "Evening," he called from the hall. "Evening," she called back. That was it. 22 years of marriage, and sometimes that's all the greeting you need. It's not coldness, it's just comfort, shorthand, the kind of thing that means, "I'm home, you're here, all is well." Thomas came into the kitchen, kissed her once on the cheek, the way he always did, and poured himself a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, and they talked about nothing important. The weather. A letter from the council about the hedge at the front. Whether the soup needed more salt. Kate stirred the pot and thought, this is a perfectly fine Tuesday. And it was. Right up until it wasn't. Dinner was quiet. Thomas ate quickly. More quickly than usual, Kate noticed. He kept glancing at his phone, not in an obvious way. Not in the way that would make your heart sink if you were the suspicious sort, just checking it. The way you check a watch when you're waiting for something, but you don't want anyone to notice you're waiting. Kate didn't say anything. She filed it away, the way you file away small things. A little folder in the back of your mind labeled, "Probably nothing." After dinner, Thomas said he had some work to finish. He'd take it up to his study. "I might have an early night," Kate said. "Good idea," he said. "Long week." And he went upstairs. Kate washed up the dishes. She dried them and stacked them the way she always did. She wiped down the counter. She turned off the radio. The house went quiet. She made herself a cup of tea, chamomile for sleeping, and took it upstairs. She read for a while. 20 minutes, maybe 30. The words weren't really going in. She was tired, but not the kind of tired that leads to sleep, the restless kind. She turned off the bedside lamp at around 9:30. The room went dark. The rain pressed against the glass. Somewhere below, she could hear the faint sound of Thomas moving around in his study, the creak of his office chair, the occasional footstep. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Not because she was worried, not yet. She simply lay there in that familiar darkness, listening to the house breathe around her. The radiator knocked, the rain fell, the wind moved through the old oak tree in the back garden, and the branches made a sound like someone slowly shuffling a deck of cards. She was almost there, almost at the edge of sleep, when she heard it. A footstep. Not from Thomas's study. That sound was below her to the left. This footstep was above her, or rather, beside her. Down the hall. Kate's eyes opened. She lay very still and listened. Another step. The same pace. Careful. Deliberate. She knew that rhythm. That was the rhythm of someone trying not to be heard. Now, Kate would be the first to tell you, she is not a dramatic woman. She does not jump to conclusions. She does not let her imagination run away with her. She had lived 60-odd years on this earth by being sensible, and she saw no reason to stop now. So she told herself, Thomas must have come to bed and gone back downstairs for something, a glass of water, his phone charger, the book he'd left on the kitchen table. That was the sensible explanation. She closed her eyes again, and then she heard the second thing. And the second thing had no sensible explanation at all. It came from the baby monitor. Now, you're probably wondering what a baby monitor was doing in Kate and Thomas's bedroom. Their children were grown. Their youngest, a daughter, had gone to university 3 years before. There was no baby in that house. But the monitor had been there for 2 years. Kate kept it, and this is important, so please remember this. She kept it because her mother-in-law, Thomas's mother, had moved into the small room at the end of the hall after her hip surgery. The woman was 81 years old, and sometimes she called out in the night and couldn't manage the stairs on her own. The monitor was practical, sensible, the kind of solution a sensible woman comes up with. Thomas's mother had passed away 8 months ago, peacefully, in that same small room at the end of the hall, and Kate had left the monitor in place simply because she hadn't gotten around to moving it. It sat on the bedside table on her side of the bed, gathering a little dust. Occasionally she switched it on by accident when she reached for her lamp in the dark. She had not switched it on tonight, or so she believed, because the monitor was on. The little green light on the receiver, the unit on her side of the bed, was glowing, faintly, but glowing, and through the speaker, through that low wash of static, she could hear footsteps. Footsteps in the room at the end of the hall. Kate sat up. Her hand found the monitor on the bedside table. She lifted it and held it close, the way you hold a shell to your ear when you're trying to hear the sea. The footsteps stopped. A pause. Long enough that she thought, maybe it's the interference. Maybe it's a neighbor. Maybe it's nothing. And then she heard Thomas's voice, low, so low she almost missed it, not whispering exactly, something between a whisper and a murmur, the kind of voice you use when you think no one can hear you. She couldn't make out every word. The static swallowed some of them whole. But she heard enough. She heard him say a name she did not recognize. And then she heard him say, "She can never know. Do you understand me? She can never know." Kate did not move. She sat in the dark with the monitor pressed to her ear, and she did not breathe, and she did not move, and she felt, not panic, not yet, but something underneath panic, something quieter and colder. The feeling of a floor you thought was solid, shifting just slightly beneath your feet. She can never know. She. Kate set the monitor down on the blanket in front of her. She looked at the green light. It was still on, still glowing. She told herself, I misheard. The static, the rain, the angle of the walls, and the way sound travels in old houses at night. I misheard. But her hands were shaking. And when she reached for the cup of chamomile tea on the nightstand, the tea she'd made for sleeping, her hand shook so hard the cup rattled against the saucer. She set it down before she could spill it. She sat in the dark and she waited. Footsteps now in the hallway, coming back toward the bedroom. The third floorboard from the landing creak, and then the bedroom door easing open and the familiar weight of Thomas settling onto his side of the bed. "You awake?" he said quietly. She said. Just that. A sound. "Sorry, didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said. "I was just drifting." A pause. "Go back to sleep," he said. His voice was warm, ordinary. It was the voice of a man with nothing to hide. The voice she had heard every night for 22 years. "Good night, Thomas," she said. "Night, love." And the room went quiet. Kate lay on her back in the dark. The monitor was still in her hand. She had not let go of it. The green light cast the faintest glow across the ceiling. She can never know. Kate stared at the ceiling and thought, who is she? And what is it that she cannot know? She would not sleep again that night. And by morning she would understand one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever her husband had been hiding all these years, it was something big enough to whisper about in an empty room in the dark. And she was going to find out what it was. Kate did not watch the clock. That was the thing she remembered most clearly, later. She didn't lie there counting the hours the way anxious people do, watching the red numbers tick over from midnight to 1 to 2. She simply lay still, in the dark, with her eyes open. And she thought. She was good at thinking. She had always been good at it. Thomas used to say, and he said it with real admiration, not as a complaint, that Kate could build an entire case out of almost nothing. "You'd have made a good detective," he told her once, years ago, after she figured out from 3 small details that their youngest had broken the kitchen window and tried to cover it up. "Nothing gets past you." She had laughed at that. She wasn't laughing now. By the time the bedroom had shifted from black to the pale, flat gray of an early November morning, Kate had made a decision. She was not going to ask Thomas directly. Not yet. This was not cowardice. Understand that. This was strategy. Because Kate knew the way you know things after 22 years with a person. That if she walked up to her husband and said, "I heard you last night in your mother's old room, and I heard what you said," one of 2 things would happen. Either he would have a perfectly reasonable explanation, something so simple it would make her feel foolish, and she would accept it and file it away and go back to sleep and never be quite sure she'd gotten the truth. Or he would know she was looking, and whatever he was hiding would go deeper underground where she'd never reach it. No, she would not ask. Not yet. First, she would look. Thomas was still asleep. She could hear it, the long, slow breathing that she knew as well as her own name. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and listened to it. Steady, untroubled. She can never know. She stood up. She did not go to his study first. That would have been reckless. Thomas slept lightly. She knew that too, and his study was directly across the landing from their bedroom, the third floorboard. She couldn't risk it. Instead, she went downstairs, slowly, one hand on the banister, stepping wide on the third step from the bottom, the one that sang out if you hit it in the middle. Her feet were cold on the kitchen tile. She didn't turn on the light. She put the kettle on, not for tea, but for cover. If Thomas woke and came down, she had a reason to be standing in the kitchen in the dark at 6 a.m. Couldn't sleep. Just making tea. Simple. Believable. She stood at the kitchen counter and she looked around the room she had spent 18 years of her life in. The corkboard on the wall with its shopping lists and school schedules long since out of date. The fruit bowl, half empty. The row of cookbooks on the shelf she'd had since before she married, the spines creased and soft. She was looking without quite knowing what she was looking for. She opened the drawer beside the cooker, the one that catches everything, the one every kitchen has. String and batteries and a torch that probably didn't work and old takeaway menus and rubber bands. She went through it carefully, with one hand, slowly, so nothing rattled. Nothing. She pulled open the drawer beneath that one. Tea towels, folded. A set of oven gloves. She closed it. The kettle came to the boil, that rising hiss, and then the click of silence. And Kate made herself a cup of tea she didn't want and stood at the window and watched the garden come slowly out of the dark. Think, she told herself. Think like a detective. The voice on the monitor had not come from Thomas's study. It had come from the small room at the end of the hall, his mother's old room, a room that had been more or less unused for the 8 months since she passed. Kate had packed away most of the furniture and personal items herself. It had felt like the right thing to do, to keep herself busy in the weeks after the funeral. She'd put the boxes in the attic, cleared the room down to the bed frame and the old chest of drawers they'd never quite gotten around to moving. Why would Thomas be in there at night? What was in that room that needed whispering about? Kate froze, her mug halfway to her lips. She stood without moving for a full 30 seconds, listening. The house settled back into silence. He turned over in his sleep. That was all. She breathed out. She set the mug down and went back upstairs. She waited until Thomas left for work. She sat at the kitchen table and she watched him eat his toast and drink his coffee and look at his phone. Briefly, turned slightly away from her, the screen angled just a few degrees toward his chest, and she said nothing. She talked about the weather. She asked if he needed his gray jacket dry cleaned. She was, in every outward way, the same Kate she had been every morning for 22 years. And Thomas was, in every outward way, the same Thomas. That was the thing that frightened her most, sitting there watching him over the rim of her mug. He looked the same. He sounded the same. The small, familiar gestures, the way he folded his napkin before he put it down, the way he tapped his jacket pocket twice before he left, checking for his keys. All of it was exactly as it had always been. She could never know. "Right," he said at the door. "Don't wait up. Might be a late one." "Okay," she said. "Drive safe." He kissed her cheek. The door latched behind him. The gravel crunched. The car engine turned over and faded down the lane. Kate counted to 60. slowly. Then she went upstairs. She started with his study. She told herself she would be quick and she would be careful and she would put everything back exactly as she found it. She stood in the doorway for a moment first, not from hesitation, but from observation. The room as he'd left it. The desk, the shelves, the filing cabinet in the corner. She wanted to memorize it before she touched anything. Thomas's study was a tidy room. That had always struck her as a slightly odd quality in a person. Not the tidiness itself, but the completeness of it. There was nothing lying around casually. No random receipts on the desk, no coffee-stained papers, no pile of things to be dealt with later. Everything was filed or shelved or put away. At the time, early in their marriage, she had taken it as a sign of discipline. Of a man who had his life in order. Standing in the doorway now, it struck her differently. It was the tidiness of someone who didn't want to leave evidence. She started with the desk drawers, left side top to bottom. She lifted each item carefully. Pens, a stapler, a box of paper clips, a small notebook. She opened the notebook. Blank. She put it back. The right-hand drawers deeper, a manila folder with what looked like tax documents going back 3 years. A calculator, a box of old business cards, Thomas's old job, the one he'd left 4 years ago when he changed companies. She flipped through them. Just cards. She pushed the drawer closed, slowly. She winced at the sound it made, a soft, wooden thud, and stood still for a second, listening to the house. Nothing, just the faint sound of wind at the window. She went to the filing cabinet. It was a 2-drawer metal cabinet, the kind that locks, pushed against the wall beside the bookshelf. She pulled the top drawer. It opened freely. Thomas had never locked it, as far as she knew. Inside, hanging files, neatly labeled. Insurance, car, house, pension, bank, joint, bank, personal. She paused on that one. Bank, personal. She had never thought twice about it. Thomas had always kept a separate account for his own expenses. Many couples did. She'd never looked at it. It had never occurred to her that she should. She pulled the folder. Inside, 3 years of statements, paper copies, folded into thirds. She unfolded the top one, the most recent from 2 months ago, and ran her eye down the columns. Most of it was ordinary. Petrol. A subscription payment she didn't recognize but could easily be something like a streaming service. Lunches during working hours. A hardware shop twice, probably for something around the house or garden. And then, near the bottom of the second page, a payment that made her stop. A transfer. A regular one, it looked like. The same amount on the same day of every month. She checked the previous statement. Same transfer, same date, same amount. She checked the one before that. Same. She stood very still and looked at the name the payment was going to. It wasn't a business name. It wasn't a utility company or a charity or anything she could file neatly away in a sensible explanation. It was a personal name, a first name she didn't recognize, and an initial for a surname. It was the same name she had heard him whisper through the baby monitor. Kate's hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected them to shake, the way they'd shaken the night before with the teacup. But they didn't. They were perfectly still. The hands of a woman moving from fear into something colder and quieter and more determined. She put the statements back. She put the folder back. She closed the drawer. She stood in the middle of the study and looked around the room. He has been sending money, she thought, every month for at least 3 years, to someone with that name, a name I have never heard in 22 years of marriage. Why? She went to the bookshelves. She ran her fingers along the spines, slowly checking for anything slipped behind the books. any envelope, any folded paper. Halfway along the second shelf, her fingers found something. She pulled the book out, an old hardback history of the British railway system that she was quite certain Thomas had never once opened, and behind it was a small plain envelope, unsealed. She opened it. Inside was a photograph, small, printed on ordinary paper, not proper photo paper, like it had been printed at home on an inkjet printer, a little grainy. It showed a child, a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting on a garden wall somewhere. Sunny day. She was squinting into the light mid-laugh, the way children do when someone calls their name and they turn before they're ready. Kate had never seen this child before in her life. But as she stood there in Thomas's tidy study in the quiet house, looking at that printed photograph, something slow and cold moved through her, because the girl in the photograph had Thomas's eyes. Not similar, not a bit like. His eyes exactly, the particular shape of them, the way the left one crinkled more than the right when he smiled. Kate put the photograph back inside the envelope. She put the envelope back behind the book. She slid the book back onto the shelf, flush with the others, exactly as it had been. She walked out of the study and pulled the door closed behind her. She stood on the landing. The house was silent around her. She put one hand flat on the wall, just for a moment, steadying herself, not from weakness, from the particular effort of holding herself together when everything inside wants to come apart. There's a child, she thought. Thomas has been sending money to a child, and that child has his eyes. She took her hand off the wall. She straightened her back. She walked to the small room at the end of the hall, the room where she'd heard him whispering last night, and she pressed her ear to the closed door and she listened. Silence. She put her hand on the door handle, and then she heard it, from inside the room, faint and brief, there and gone, like a trick of the ears, the sound of a phone, vibrating once, just once, on a hard surface. Kate pulled her hand back. Thomas was at work. He had left 40 minutes ago. She had watched the car pull out of the drive, hadn't she? She stepped back from the door. 1 step, 2. She turned and walked back down the hall, back down the stairs, back to the kitchen. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the tabletop and she looked at them and she made herself think clearly. There is someone in this house, she thought, or there is a phone in that room that Thomas left behind, or there is something in that room he is not done with yet. Either way, she understood something with absolute certainty now. This was not a small thing. This was not a mistake, or a misheard sentence, or a reasonable explanation she hadn't thought of yet. This was the shape of a secret. 22 years old, maybe more. Patient. Hidden. And now, just barely, beginning to come to the surface. And Kate was going to find out every last piece of it, even if it broke her heart, especially if it broke her heart. Kate opened the door. The room smelled of old wood and cold air and something faintly floral. The dried lavender sachets she had tucked into the chest of drawers after Thomas's mother passed, to keep the space from going stale. She hadn't been in here much since then, a few times to check the window latch in winter, once to look for a spare blanket. The room was as she'd left it. The bare bed frame, the chest of drawers, the curtains drawn so the light was thin and gray. A small square of pale carpet worn flat in front of the window where Margaret, that had been Thomas's mother's name, Margaret, had stood every morning to look out at the garden. Kate stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. She was looking for the phone. She found it in 40 seconds. It was on top of the chest of drawers behind the curtain, pushed back against the wall. A mobile phone. Not a smartphone, not one of the sleek flat ones everyone carried now. An old one. Small and basic, a pay-as-you-go model, the kind you could buy in a petrol station for £20. The screen was dark. Kate picked it up. She pressed the button on the side. The screen lit up. No password. Just a home screen. Plain, no wallpaper, and a single notification. One text message received 22 minutes ago. She opened it. 3 words. Is it done? No name. Just a number. A mobile number she didn't recognize with a prefix that suggested it wasn't local. She stared at those 3 words for a long moment. Is it done? No question mark. The kind of message sent by someone who already expects the answer to be yes. She checked the sent messages. Empty. Wiped. She checked the call log. 2 numbers, both the same unknown number, both in the last 10 days. She put the phone back exactly where she'd found it. Behind the curtain, against the wall. She walked out of the room, pulled the door to, and stood on the landing with her hands pressed together in front of her mouth, thinking. There was a name on those bank statements, a first name and an initial. There was a photograph of a girl with Thomas's eyes. There was a phone in a room he visited in the dark. And there was someone, somewhere, asking, "Is it done?" Kate went downstairs, picked up her car keys from the hook by the door, put on her coat, and drove into town. She drove the way she always drove, both hands on the wheel, steady speed. But her mind was moving in a different direction entirely. She was cataloging, sorting, pulling out every odd memory from the last few years and holding it up to this new, colder light. The phone calls Thomas sometimes took outside, in the garden, standing with his back to the house. The weekend 2 years ago when he told her he was visiting an old friend from university, a friend she'd never met, whose name she couldn't now recall. The way he'd reacted, just slightly too quickly, just a half beat too firmly, when their youngest had asked during a family dinner whether there were any relatives on his side they'd never met. Not really, he'd said. Small family, always has been. Small family. Kate tightened her hands on the wheel. The rain fell harder. The wipers swept it away and it came back, and the wipers swept it away again. The road ahead was empty and gray, and the hedges on either side were dark with water. She was not going to the library, which was where she'd told herself she was going. She was going to find the storage unit. Let me explain. 6 years ago, Thomas had rented a small storage unit on the edge of town. She knew about it. It wasn't a secret, or it hadn't seemed like one at the time. He told her he needed somewhere to keep tools and some old boxes from when his father died, things he wasn't ready to throw away but didn't want in the house. She'd thought nothing of it. People did that sort of thing. She had never been there. There had never been a reason to go. He paid for it annually. She'd seen it on the joint account once, a payment to a storage company, and had assumed, without ever really thinking about it, that it was the same unit, the same tools, the same dusty boxes. Now, sitting in the car with the rain on the windscreen, she thought, what else is in there? She knew the name of the company. She'd seen it on the bank statement enough times. She looked it up on her phone at a red light, found the address, and drove. The storage facility was on a light industrial road on the eastern edge of town. The kind of road that has a tire fitter and a builder's merchant and a wholesale cash and carry, all gray and flat and unloved. The storage company's sign was orange and white. The car park was half empty. Kate sat in the car for a moment after she pulled in. She had Thomas's spare key on her keyring. She had carried it for years. That was the other thing, the detail she hadn't thought about until this moment. When they'd first rented the unit, Thomas had put a key on her ring without being asked. "In case you ever need to get in," he'd said. She had never once used it, but she still had it. She looked at it now. Small, flat, silver, attached to the ring between the spare back door key and the key to her sister's house in Edinburgh. She had carried Thomas's secret for 6 years without knowing it. She got out of the car. The facility was mostly self-serve. A keypad at the entrance for the outer door. Thomas had given her that code too years ago, and she still remembered it because it was their wedding anniversary. She punched it in without irony and pushed through the door. Inside, a long corridor, fluorescent lighting, rows of orange roller doors on either side. The numbers stenciled in black above each one. The air smelled of dust and damp cardboard, and the particular staleness of rooms that are sealed for long periods of time. Kate's shoes were quiet on the concrete floor. She walked slowly. She was aware, acutely aware, that there was a camera mounted at the end of the corridor, pointing down the length of it, a small black dome watching. She kept her face down slightly. Not obviously, just the natural angle of someone reading the numbers on the doors. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She had a key. Her name was almost certainly on the rental agreement somewhere. She found the unit, number 31. She crouched and fitted the key to the padlock. Her knee touched the cold concrete. The key turned. The padlock opened. She stood and gripped the handle at the bottom of the roller door and pulled. The unit was roughly the size of a large garden shed. A single bare bulb on a cord, which she pulled. The light was harsh and yellow. She stood in the doorway and looked. There were boxes. 6, maybe 8 of them, stacked along the back wall. Some plastic crates with lids. A fold-up table leaning against one side. A pair of old toolboxes, which matched what Thomas had told her. And in the corner, a dark gray metal filing cabinet, padlocked. Kate started with the boxes. Most of them were exactly what Thomas had said they were. His father's things. Old documents, a few framed photographs, some paperback books gone yellow at the edges. There was a box of tools and one of old cables and electrical odds and ends. Ordinary. All of it perfectly ordinary. She was on the 5th box when she found the discrepancy. This box was the same brown cardboard as the others, sealed with the same tape, but it was lighter, and the tape across the top was newer. The color hadn't aged the same way, hadn't gone the brittle yellowish brown of tape that has been sitting in a cold unit for years. This tape was still pale, still slightly shiny. Someone had opened this box recently and resealed it. Kate's hands were steady again. She noticed that about herself, that in moments of real consequence, her hands went still. She would think about that later, what it said about her. Inside the box, papers, a lot of them. Loose sheets and folded documents, and what looked like 2 manila envelopes, both sealed. She lifted the first envelope. It had a solicitor's name and address printed in the top left corner, a firm she didn't recognize, based in a town about 40 miles away, a town she and Thomas had no connection with whatsoever. Her finger slid under the seal. Inside, a document, several pages stapled. She turned to the first page and read the heading. She had to read it twice. It was a birth certificate, or rather, it was a copy of a birth certificate, and the name on it, the child's name, was a name she recognized instantly. It was the name of their eldest, their son. But the details on this certificate were different from the one she had known for 31 years. The date of birth was the same. The full name was the same, but the parents listed, the names in the section for mother and father, were not Kate and Thomas. One of the names was Thomas, his full name correctly spelled, unmistakably him. The other name, the mother's name, was not Kate. It was the same name from the bank statement, the same name she had heard whispered through the baby monitor in the dark. Kate did not make a sound. She stood in that cold storage unit and she held the document in both hands, and she read the mother's name again, slowly, every letter. A woman she had never met. A woman whose name she had heard for the first time less than 24 hours ago. A woman to whom Thomas had been sending money every month for at least 3 years. The mother of her son. Her son. The boy she had held in a hospital room 31 years ago, red-faced and furious at being born. The boy she had walked to school and taught to ride a bicycle and sat up with through every fever and every heartbreak. Her son, who had her nose in Thomas's stubborn streak and who called her on Sunday mornings when he remembered. Her son. Except, according to this document, he wasn't. Not entirely. Not in the way she had always believed. She forced herself to keep going. She put the birth certificate down on top of the box, carefully, face down. She reached into the envelope again. There was a second document underneath, shorter, a single page. It was a letter, handwritten. The date at the top was 8 years ago. She read it. By the time she reached the third paragraph, her jaw had tightened so hard her back teeth ached. By the time she reached the end, she understood, in broad shape at least, the lie that had been living inside her marriage since before her marriage had properly begun. She was not going to cry, not here, not now. She put the letter back into the envelope. She put the envelope back into the box beneath the other papers. She pressed the flaps down and smoothed the tape back as flat as it would go. She stood up. Her knees ached from the cold floor. Kate went very still. The footsteps were unhurried, measured. They passed the door of Unit 31 without slowing. She heard them, even and steady. And then the sound of another unit opening further down the corridor. She let out a slow breath. But even then, with the footsteps explained and the corridor quiet again, the feeling didn't leave her. It settled on the back of her neck and stayed there. The feeling of being watched, of having been slightly too visible, slightly too long, in a place she had never been before. She pulled the cord. The yellow light went out. She pulled the roller door down, snapped the padlock shut, walked back down the corridor with her eyes forward and her pace steady and her face arranged into the expression of a woman doing nothing unusual on a Wednesday morning. She pushed through the outer door. The cold air hit her. The rain had softened to a fine mist. She got to her car. She got in. She locked the doors. And she sat there, engine off, hands in her lap, and she looked at the storage company's orange and white sign through the wet windscreen, and she thought about her son. She thought about his face, the particular way he laughed, the way he'd held her hand in the hospital when Thomas's mother died without being asked, just reached across and held it. She thought about what she now knew, what it meant, what it would do to him if he ever found out, what it would do to all of them. Then she thought about Thomas. Thomas, who had known this for 31 years. Thomas, who had stood beside her in that hospital room and held that baby and never said a word. She was going home. And tonight, when Thomas walked through the front door and put his keys in the bowl and said, "Evening," she would say evening back exactly as she always had. And he would not know. Not yet. Not until she was ready. The house was dark. That was the first thing Kate noticed. She pushed the front door open and stood in the hallway, and not a single light was on. Not the kitchen, not the landing, not the small lamp in the sitting room that Thomas usually switched on before it got dark, because he said a house with no lights on in the evening looked abandoned. His car was in the drive. She had seen it when she pulled in, parked at a slightly odd angle, not the neat, straight pull-in he always did, but crooked, like he'd stopped in a hurry. She stood in the dark hallway and listened. "Thomas." Not a question, not a call, just his name, said at a normal volume, into the dark. A pause. Long enough that she thought, briefly, with a lurch in her chest, that she'd been wrong, that the car meant nothing, that he wasn't here. Then, from the sitting room, in here, she didn't take her coat off. She didn't know why. She simply walked to the sitting room doorway and stood there with her coat still buttoned and her car keys still in her hand, and she looked at her husband. Thomas was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one he always sat in. He hadn't turned a lamp on. He was sitting in the last of the gray afternoon light, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, perfectly still. And he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before in 22 years. Not guilt, not anger. Something older than either of those. Something that looked, she thought, like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just, finally, set it down. "You're home early," she said. "Yes," he said. She waited. "Sit down, Kate." "I'll stand." A pause. The clock. 1 tick, 2, 3. "All right," he said, quietly. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in that silence, that long, weighted silence that pressed against the walls of the room, she understood that he knew, not suspected. Knew that she had been somewhere today, that she had found something, that the thing he had kept buried for 31 years had finally, today, come up into the light. "The storage unit," she said. It wasn't a question either. She was simply naming the place so they could both stop pretending they were talking around it. Thomas closed his eyes, just for a moment. When he opened them again, he looked, she thought, about 10 years older than he had at breakfast that morning. "How long have you known about it?" he said. "I found the key in my bag," she said. "I've had it for years. You gave it to me." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, not close to a smile, but the faint, sad recognition of a man who has just understood the particular shape of the trap he built himself. "I did," he said. "I did give it to you." "Tell me about the bank statements," she said. Silence. "Thomas, Kate, tell me about the bank statements." Her voice was level. She had promised herself that on the drive home. Level and clear and no crying, not yet, not until she had every piece of it. Thomas put both hands over his face. He held them there for a moment, pressed against his eyes, his fingers spread. Then he dragged them slowly down and set them back on the arms of the chair. "Her name," he said, "is Diane." "I met her before you," Thomas said. "Before us. We were together for almost 2 years. It was serious. I thought it was going to be permanent." He paused. Kate said nothing. "And then she fell pregnant." He said it flatly, just a statement of fact. "We were 26. Neither of us had planned it. She was frightened. I was frightened. And then, before we had time to decide anything, she lost it. A miscarriage. Early. But it changed things between us. It changed something. And about 4 months after that, we ended it. Just fell apart. The way things do." Kate looked at him. She didn't speak. "I met you 8 months later," he said. "And I know, Kate, I know what I'm about to say sounds like a line, but it isn't. When I met you, I genuinely, honestly, thought that chapter was finished. Diane had moved away. We hadn't spoken. I thought..." He stopped, his jaw tightened. "I thought that was done." He leaned forward in the chair, both elbows on his knees, eyes down. And then 14 months after our wedding, she called me. The room was so quiet that Kate could hear her own breathing. She told me she was pregnant, Thomas said. Had been, for a while. She said she hadn't called sooner because she wasn't certain, and because she stopped herself. She said she needed me to know, but she wasn't asking for anything. Those were her exact words. I'm not asking for anything. She had a life. She had a partner. She said she just needed me to know. Thomas looked up. He looked at Kate directly, and his eyes were dry, but only just. The timing, he said. The timing meant the baby was mine. Silence. The clock ticked. Once, twice. The radiator knocked low and hollow. She didn't want to disrupt anything, he said. She didn't want to disrupt our marriage. She said she was going to raise the child with her partner, that he didn't know, and she wasn't going to tell him. She just needed me to know. But you sent money, Kate said. Her voice was completely flat. Thomas nodded. Not at first. She wouldn't take it at first. But when the girl was about 3, and Diane's partner left and she was on her own, and He stopped. I couldn't just do nothing. You could have told me, Kate said. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Thomas looked at her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. It was simply true. You could have told me, she said again, not louder, not with more anger, just with the same terrible, quiet weight. On any one of the 10,000 days between then and now, you could have told me. I know, he said. So why didn't you? Thomas stood up. He didn't come toward her. He walked to the window instead and stood with his back to her, looking out at the garden, dark now, the shapes of the hedges just barely visible against the gray sky. The first year, he said, I didn't tell you because I was a coward. I'll say that plainly. I was 28 years old and I was terrified of losing you. And I told myself it wasn't relevant because Diane wasn't asking for anything and the child was going to be raised by someone else and no one would ever need to know. He paused. His reflection in the window, she could see it faintly, was looking at the floor. The second year, I didn't tell you because you were pregnant with our son. And I told myself it would destroy something, that it would poison it, the pregnancy, the happiness of it. I told myself I'd tell you after, when things were settled. But you didn't. No. And the third year? He turned slightly, not all the way, just enough that she could see the side of his face. The third year, he said, our son was born. And I looked at him. You know how I looked at him, Kate. You were there. And I thought, if I tell her now this is what he grows up knowing about his father, this is the first thing, the defining thing. His voice dropped. I couldn't do it. Kate pressed the car keys hard into her palm. She felt the teeth of them. And then it was 5 years, Thomas said. And then it was 10. And every year it got harder, not easier. Every year the lie had more floors, more walls, more rooms I'd built on top of it. He turned all the way round now. He was facing her across the dark room. I'm not telling you this to excuse it. There's no excusing it. I'm telling you because you asked me why, and I want to tell you the truth, the real truth, all of it, tonight. The birth certificate, Kate said. Thomas's face changed. Whose idea was it to put your name on her birth certificate? A pause, heavy and specific. Diane's partner didn't know the child wasn't his, Thomas said slowly. He was on the original certificate. When he left, she had it amended. She wanted the record to be accurate. She wrote to me and said she was doing it regardless, that the child had a right to know her father. Her father, Kate said. Yes. You have a daughter. Thomas said nothing. You have a daughter, Kate said again, and something in her voice shifted, just fractionally, just a degree, from flat to something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but lived in the exact place between them. She's 8 or 9 years old. She has your eyes. And she has been alive for 8 or 9 years, and I have been living in this house, and I did not know she existed. Thomas opened his mouth. Don't, Kate said, just the word, quiet and absolute. He closed his mouth. She walked to the sofa and she sat down. Not because her legs were weak, she would not allow that, but because she was going to be in this room for a while yet, and she was going to do it on her own terms. The phone in your mother's room, she said. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. Diane's number, a second phone I kept. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like what it is. It was so there would never be any crossover, no calls on my regular phone she might see, no messages, to protect yourself. To protect you, he said, and for the first time his voice had heat in it. Not anger, but something desperate, something that had been pressing against the inside of his ribs for a long time. I made the wrong choice, Kate. I know that. I have known that every single day for 30 years. But I made it for you, do you understand? Not for me. I was trying to keep this family, our family, the one we built. I was trying to keep it whole. The silence that followed that was the longest one yet. The clock ticked. The radiator knocked. Somewhere upstairs, a draft moved through the house, and something small shifted, a door easing on its hinges. Kate looked at her husband, at the man she had shared a bed with for 22 years, at the face she knew better than her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his mouth sat when he was trying not to show what he was feeling. You told her she could never know, Kate said. Last night, in your mother's room, I heard you. Thomas looked at her. Something broke open very slightly in his expression. The girl, Kate said, your daughter. Does she know about me? A pause. No, he said. Diane told her the situation was complicated, that her father was, that there were reasons they couldn't be in contact. She's been asking more questions lately. She's getting older. He stopped. Last night Diane called to tell me that the girl had started asking about us, about this family, about whether she had brothers or sisters. Kate felt something move through her chest that she couldn't name. She asked if she had brothers or sisters, Kate said. Yes. And she does, Kate said. She has a brother who is 31 years old and has no idea she exists. Thomas sat back down. He sat heavily, the way a much older man sits down, and he put his head in his hands, and the room held them both, the clock ticking between them, the radiator cooling, the dark garden pressing against the window. And Kate looked at the man she loved, the man she had chosen, the man who had spent 30 years building a careful wall between two halves of a life he couldn't bear to give up either half of. And she felt she would try to explain this later when it was further away, and she was not entirely sure she could. She felt two things at exactly the same time. She felt the specific, clean, bone-deep pain of a woman who has just discovered that the life she thought she was living was not entirely real. And she felt, underneath that, something else. Something that frightened her more than the anger did. Something that felt, if she was being completely honest with herself, uncomfortably like understanding. Not forgiveness. She was nowhere near forgiveness. She might never get there, but understanding. The faint, terrible understanding of a woman who knows the man in front of her, who knows every version of him, and can see, even now, even through this, exactly how a good man made a terrible choice and then spent 30 years becoming its prisoner. She did not say any of this out loud. Instead, she said, "I'm going to go upstairs now. I need you to sleep in the spare room tonight." Thomas lifted his head. "And tomorrow," she said, "you are going to tell me everything, every detail, from the beginning, and then we are going to decide, together, what happens next." She stood up. "Kate, not tonight, Thomas." She picked up her keys from where she'd set them on the cushion beside her. "Tonight is finished." She walked to the door. She stopped, one hand on the frame, her back to him. "The girl," she said, without turning round. "What's her name?" A pause, the longest pause of the night. "Rose," he said. Kate nodded once, a small private nod, to no one in particular. Then she walked out of the room and up the stairs and closed the bedroom door behind her. And in the sitting room below, in the dark, the clock ticked on. Kate couldn't sleep. She had known she wouldn't be able to. She'd lain in the dark for an hour. The bedroom ceiling, the same ceiling it had always been, the same shadows, the same familiar nothing. And the thoughts wouldn't stop moving, not frantic thoughts, not panicked ones, just a slow, relentless turning, like a wheel that had no intention of stopping. She got up at 1:30 and went downstairs and out through the back door into the garden. She didn't take a coat. She felt the cold and she let it stand there, and she stood in it, and she looked up at the sky, heavy and dark, no stars, the kind of November sky that sits on top of everything like a lid, and she breathed. The garden at night was a different place, familiar shapes made strange by the dark. The oak tree, enormous and still. The stone bird bath, pale and quiet. The hedges along the far wall, thick and shapeless. She had stood in this garden for 18 years. She had stood here in every season, hanging washing on summer mornings, watching the children chase each other through the long July evenings, standing at this exact spot in February cold, waiting for the dog to come back in, years ago now, before the dog grew old and they lost him. She had thought she knew this garden completely. She was beginning to understand that she had thought that about a great many things. She walked to the far end, near the wall, where the garden table sat. She didn't sit down, she just stood by it, her hand on the back of one of the chairs, and looked back at the house. All the windows dark. The spare room at the top, dark too. Thomas, behind that window, probably also not sleeping. She looked at the back wall of the house. Just to the left of the kitchen door, at about waist height, there was a wooden post set into the brickwork. A smooth, pale post, about 4 feet tall, nailed there 20 years ago when their son was barely walking. A height marker. She had measured both children against it every birthday. A small ceremony they'd invented for no particular reason, just one of those private rituals a family accumulates without meaning to. She'd drawn a line in pencil, written the date and the name, and pressed the next candle onto the cake. She walked over to it now. She ran her fingers down the post in the dark, feeling the small ridges of the pencil line she couldn't see. So many of them. Each one a day she had stood here with a child, pressing their back flat against the wood, trying to stand as tall as possible. Thomas holding the pencil, squinting like a man conducting important scientific work. She remembered the sound of that. His voice, ridiculous and grave. "Stand up straight, stand up straight, no cheating." And the children laughing, both of them laughing, collapsing into each other when the measurement was done. She pressed her hand flat against the post. She held it there. That sound was real, she thought. That laugh was real. She went back inside. She didn't know why, just that standing in the cold had done what she needed it to do, had emptied her out a little, made some room. She went to the sitting room. She didn't turn the light on. She sat on the sofa in the dark, and after a minute she reached over and opened the drawer of the side table, without looking, purely by memory, and her hand found the photo album. The old one, the heavy one, the one from before everything went digital and photographs started living in phones instead of rooms. She set it on her lap. She opened it. She couldn't see the photographs. The room was too dark, but she turned the pages anyway, feeling the slight give of each plastic sleeve, and in her mind she could see every one of them perfectly. She had looked at them so many times across so many years that the pictures no longer needed light to be visible. There, the children on a beach somewhere, squinting into the sun. There, Christmas morning, the youngest still in her pajamas, tearing at paper with both hands. There, a birthday somewhere in the middle years, a garden in summer, adults around a table, everyone laughing at something just outside the frame. And Thomas in every other photograph. Thomas with his arm around her shoulders. Thomas with a child on his back. Thomas at the kitchen table on an ordinary morning, not posed, not aware of the camera, just there, reading something, a cup in his hand, the light coming in. She looked at that photograph in the dark. Or rather, she held it, she traced its edges, she let it exist in her hands. And she felt the two things at the same time again, the way she had in the sitting room facing him. The grief of it. The specific, devastating grief of a woman who has just learned that the life she thought she was living had a room in it she was never shown. 22 years of mornings and meals and arguments and laughter and the 10,000 small intimacies of a shared life. And underneath all of it, this thing he had carried, this other life, thin and hidden, running alongside theirs like a shadow. She grieved that. She let herself grieve it properly, sitting in the dark with the album in her hands. The marriage she had thought she had, the version of Thomas she had believed in completely. She let herself feel the loss of those things because they were real losses, and they deserved to be mourned. And then, slowly, the way light comes in under a door before you open it. The other thing. The photographs in her hands were real. The beach, the birthdays, the ordinary Tuesday morning with a cup of tea. All of it real. None of it canceled. The love in those photographs, his love for her, for their children, the love that was visible in every image even when he wasn't looking at the camera, that had not been a performance. She knew him too well to believe that. She had spent 22 years learning the difference between Thomas performing happiness and Thomas feeling it. He had felt it, all of it. A man can hold a secret and love truly at the same time. She had not known that before tonight. She wished she still didn't know it, because it would have been simpler, cleaner, so much easier to be simply and wholly angry. But she knew it now. The secret had been a betrayal. She would not minimize that. She would not smooth it over or excuse it or pretend it was anything less than what it was. He had made a choice, 30 years ago, and then again every day since, that was not his alone to make. And she had paid the price of that choice without ever being given the chance to consent to it. That was true. And also true, the man in those photographs had loved her, really loved her, not as a performance, not as a cover story, as the realest thing in his life. Both things were true at the same time. She sat with that for a long time. The clock on the mantelpiece counted the minutes. The house breathed around her. And somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, in the dark, with an old photo album on her lap and cold feet and a grief she hadn't finished feeling yet, Kate made her decision. Not because it was easy. It was the furthest thing from easy. Not because he deserved it. That wasn't the point. The point was what she deserved. And what she deserved was not to let one man's secret become the thing that defined the rest of her life. She deserved to choose. Freely, clearly, with her eyes open and the full truth in front of her. She chose to stay. Not for Thomas, for herself. For the woman in those photographs who had built something real, even if the ground beneath it had not been entirely solid. For the life that was still here, still possible, changed now, yes, different now, yes, but still hers. She closed the album. She set it back in the drawer. She went to the kitchen and washed her face at the sink in the cold, and she looked at herself in the dark window above it, her own reflection, dim and quiet. And she said nothing. She just looked. Then she dried her hands and went upstairs to bed. The next morning came the way mornings always do, without asking permission. Kate woke at 6:14. She knew because she looked at the clock the moment her eyes opened, the way you do after a night of shallow sleep, when some part of you has been monitoring the hours even while the rest of you pretended to rest. The bed was cold on Thomas's side, which meant he had done what she asked. She lay there for a moment and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. Quiet. The particular quiet of a home that has had something large pass through it, like the stillness after a storm when the trees have stopped moving but everything is still wet. She got up. She did not check the spare room. She went downstairs, put the kettle on, and stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden come up out of the dark. The oak tree at the bottom. The hedges she kept meaning to cut back. The old stone bird bath Thomas had found at a market 15 years ago and carried home in the back of the car, wrapped in a blanket, grinning like a boy. She made 2 cups of tea. She didn't plan to. Her hands just did it, the way hands do when they have performed the same task so many thousand times that thought stops being part of the process. 2 cups, side by side, the way it had always been. She heard him on the stairs, the 3rd floorboard, that creak. Thomas came in and stopped when he saw the 2nd cup. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at her. She nodded at the chair. He sat down. They drank their tea in silence, and the robin sang outside, and the morning came in through the kitchen window, pale and cold and clean, and Kate thought, this is not forgiveness, but it is a beginning of something. She was not yet sure what. He talked for 3 hours. She had asked for everything, and he gave her everything. Or as close to everything as a person can give when they are dismantling 30 years of careful architecture brick by brick. He told her about Diane, about the call, about the years of distance, and then the slow, guilty gravity of the monthly payments, the 2nd phone, the visits he had never made but had come close to making twice. He told her about Rose, about the photographs Diane sent occasionally, which he kept in the storage unit because he couldn't bring himself to delete them and couldn't bring them into the house. He told her, and his voice broke only once, near the end, when he talked about their son. About standing in that hospital room holding a newborn boy and knowing in that same moment that there was another child somewhere who carried the same blood. About the choice he had made right there in that room with Kate exhausted and luminous in the bed beside him. He had chosen them. He wanted her to know that. He had chosen this, Kate and their children and this house and this life. It was a real choice, not a convenient one. Kate listened to all of it. She asked questions when she needed to. She did not cry. When he was done, the kitchen was fully bright, and both their cups were long empty, and the robin had gone quiet. "I need time," she said. "I know." "I don't know how much. That's all right." She looked at him across the table. "I'm not telling you it's going to be fine, Thomas. I don't know if it's going to be fine." "I know," he said again, "but I'm also not—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "I'm not ending 22 years over breakfast. I'm not that hasty." Something shifted in his face, not relief. It was too early for relief, but the particular expression of a man who has just been told he is still in the room, that he has not yet been asked to leave. "There is one condition," Kate said. Thomas waited. "Rose," she said. The name still felt strange in her mouth, new and fragile, like a thing just made. "She is a child. She did not choose any of this, and she asked, you told me," she asked, "whether she had brothers or sisters." "Yes." "She deserves an answer to that question," Kate said. "I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't know how or when, but that child is not going to grow up in the dark because two adults couldn't manage their own lives properly." She paused. "Are we agreed on that?" Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and she could see it in his eyes. Not just relief, not just gratitude, something deeper. The recognition of a man who has just been shown clearly and without ceremony the quality of the woman sitting across the table from him. "We're agreed," he said. Kate nodded. She picked up both empty cups and took them to the sink. "Right," she said. "I'm going to shower, and then I think we should probably eat something." And that, in its entirety, was how it began. Not with a grand gesture, not with tears and embraces and promises made in the heat of crisis that neither person can keep, with two empty cups being set in a sink, with the ordinary, stubborn, unglamorous decision to keep going. It was not easy. Kate would be the first to say that. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of her life. There were days when the anger came back, not as a storm, but as a cold, persistent thing, like a draft under a door you can never quite seal. Days when she looked across the dinner table and felt the distance between them like a physical object, something solid and occupying space. There were also, gradually, other days when she caught herself laughing at something he said before she remembered to stop herself. Days when the distance closed just slightly, like a door easing on its hinges rather than swinging open all at once. They saw a counselor. That had been Kate's condition, not a request, a condition, and Thomas had agreed without hesitation. They sat in a quiet office every Wednesday afternoon for 7 months, and they said things to each other they had never said in 22 years of marriage, things that had nothing to do with Diane or Rose, things that had been sitting unspoken in the ordinary corners of an ordinary life for decades. Kate discovered in that process that the secret had not been the only wall. It had simply been the most visible one. And Thomas discovered that the woman across from him, the one he had spent 30 years trying to protect from the truth, was considerably stronger than the protection he'd built had ever given her credit for being. As for Rose, that came later, slowly, carefully, a letter first. Kate had written it herself, which had surprised Thomas. She wrote it to Diane, not warmly, not coldly, but plainly. She said, "I know who you are now. I know about Rose, and I believe she deserves more than silence." She said she was not promising anything except a willingness to try. Diane had written back within a week. The first meeting, Kate and Thomas and Diane, in a cafe in the town 40 miles away, lasted 90 minutes and was, by all accounts, extraordinarily difficult. Nothing was resolved. Everything was said. They drove home without speaking for the first 40 minutes, and then Thomas had pulled into a lay-by and sat with his hands on the wheel and said, "Thank you for coming." And Kate had looked out of the window at the bare winter hedges and said, "I didn't do it for you." She had done it for a 9-year-old girl sitting on a garden wall somewhere, squinting into the sun, mid-laugh. She had done it because that girl had Thomas's eyes. And because whatever else was true, however many walls had been built and secrets kept and choices made in the dark, that girl was real. She was alive. She was part of the story now, whether anyone had chosen it or not. And Kate had spent 60-odd years being sensible. And the most sensible thing she knew, the thing she had always known, in the long, quiet center of herself, was that you cannot build anything good on top of someone else's invisibility. Not a marriage, not a family, not a life worth the name. So, that's Kate's story. I've been sitting with it for a few weeks now, since she first wrote to me, since I first read it through. And I keep coming back to the same thought. We talk about secrets as though they are always acts of cruelty, as though the person who hides the truth is always simply a villain. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes people hide things because they are selfish, or because they are afraid of consequences, or because they simply do not care enough about the other person to be honest. But sometimes, and I think Thomas is one of these cases, though you may disagree with me, and I'd be genuinely curious to hear your thoughts, sometimes a person hides the truth because they love someone so much they cannot bear to be the one who breaks them. They convince themselves that the kindest thing, the most loving thing, is to carry the weight alone, to keep the walls standing, to let the other person live in a house that looks whole from the outside. The tragedy is that it never works. It never, ever works, because the weight doesn't stay with the one person. It seeps. It gets into the foundations, and the house that looked whole begins slowly to tilt. What I find extraordinary about Kate is not that she found the truth, it's what she did with it. She could have walked. She had every right. No one would have blamed her. No one would have said, "Kate, you should have stayed." She could have closed the door on 22 years and started again, and it would have been a perfectly reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. Instead, she made a harder choice. She chose to look at the full picture, all of it, including the parts that were painful, and decide, with her eyes open, what she wanted to do next. That is not weakness. That is not naivety. That is one of the most difficult things a human being can do. To hold the person who hurt you and the person who loves you in the same pair of hands, and to sit with the contradiction, and to decide, deliberately, freely, on your own terms, what you are willing to build from what remains. I don't know if Kate and Thomas will be all right. She didn't tell me the end of the story, because the end of the story hasn't happened yet. What she told me was what she knew so far. And what she knew was that she was still standing, still choosing, still moving forward. And that, I think, is enough. That is more than enough. We spend so much of our lives believing that we know the people closest to us. We know their footsteps on the stairs. We know which floorboard they'll hit. We know the sound of their key in the lock and the way they hold a cup and the particular shape of their silence when something is wrong. And we do know those things. Those things are real. But people are large. People are deep. And the ones we love most are sometimes carrying rooms inside themselves that we have never been invited into, rooms they furnished quietly, in the dark, hoping we would never notice the door. The question is not whether that frightens us. The question is what we do when we finally find the door. Thank you for spending this evening with me and with Kate. If her story moved you, if it made you think, or feel, or remember something of your own, then she'll be glad you heard it. She asked me to tell you that. She said, "Tell them I hope it helps. Knowing you're not alone in the strange and complicated mess of loving someone for a long time, I hope that helps." I think it does, Kate. I think it does. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it, not just scroll past. If you were Kate and you heard those words through the baby monitor in the dark, what would you have done? Would you have confronted Thomas the next morning? Would you have walked away? Or would you have made the same quiet, difficult choice she made, to stay, to look, to try to understand before deciding? There's no right answer. I genuinely want to know yours. Leave it in the comments below. Kate reads them. She won't reply. She's a private person and she's earned that, but she reads them. And knowing that other people are sitting with her story, turning it over, asking the same questions she asked herself in that dark bedroom with the monitor in her hand, she says it matters. And if this story reached you tonight, if it found you at the right moment, please share it with someone who might need it, someone who is carrying something, someone who is standing outside a door trying to decide whether to open it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is simply say, "I heard a story. I thought of you." Subscribe if you haven't. There are more stories coming, more people who wrote to me from the quiet corners of their lives, asking me to say out loud what they couldn't say for themselves. I'll be here. Good night.